Sounds good. Thanks, Jacob. So getting started, Jacob gave me a little bit of an intro, but partner and CEO at Headway. Have spent my time kind of over the years, over the last 15 plus years in product design, in some product strategy and management, and then also in development. So looking forward to kind of bridge the gap into how you can use some tactics in product strategy and design and tools to learn more about your idea and build your startup without waiting really on the full version of your product or on developers. So a little bit about what we do at Headway, just to give you some context, is we help launch and grow new digital products with less risk. And a lot of that relies on prototyping and user research and primary research and finding folks that we think have the problem and then being able to create testing vehicles to bring those in front of and really open doors of opportunity. And so that looks like startups looking to launch new products, applications, platforms, and then corporations that also want to innovate. So one thing we'll talk about a little bit first, just to kind of set the stage, is validated learning. And part of this is really understanding what problem are you solving and for who? What are you looking to learn? And what's the best method and medium to learn it? And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go into prototypes later on in this session. But wanted to set the stage with some of those questions and really following the methodology of build, measure, learn, where building isn't really building a product, it's building something that you can get in front of users. It could be a interview script, it could be questions, it could be a scratch pad sketch that you get in front of somebody, something to communicate your idea, but really going into it, what are you looking to learn and who are you looking to learn that from? And then figuring out the best way to learn that, the best method, and then being able to actually measure, learn from it, and then repeat this cycle together. And as a startup, one of the important mindsets to have is to address risk head on. And here's an example: if you were to just start your startup journey by building a product and you spent, let's say this time horizon was 6 months, you spent 6 months building something, but didn't really address the risks that you had in your product. And those risks show up as assumptions that are behaviors you think people will do, or legal risk concerns, integration concerns, depending on what your startup is. And so one of the things is really just to address highest risk head on and continually reduce your risk. And so here, by using the lean startup methodology or the scientific method, essentially the build, measure, learn cycle, to figure out what's your highest risk, address it, and then continue to go through this cycle where you can learn enough about your users so that you're building small experiments that you can be objective about and then ultimately get closer to launching to the market. Another thing that's really important here as you think about how you're going to learn from your customers and how you're going to sorry, I don't know if you can hear that, my daughter in the background, but being able to really focus on who you're solving a problem for and what problem you're solving is going to be really important. And this is a visual I really like from Greg McCown on essentialism, where a lot of products and a lot of startups end up starting with all of these problems that they want to solve, and they put a lot of effort towards solving each one a little bit, but don't really compete, with what's in the market. And so one of the recommendations is to focus on solving a problem for a specific person and really focusing on solving that better than anyone in the market. And that's niching down is super, super valuable. And as you think about validating your idea or making traction on your idea without a product, it's really about creating these doors for customers to walk through, giving them an opportunity to vote with their time, with their money, with their reputation, and essentially take that next step and go into action. So a key part about gaining proof and gaining confidence for your idea is trying to bridge the gap between what users say and tell you and what people actually do. And here, if somebody says, hey, I'm going to climb Mount Everest, but has never climbed a mountain before, there's a lot of assumptions that go into it. I could have the aspirations to do it, but not really understanding the time commitment of, hey, you have to be at base camp for multiple weeks or months to adjust to the air. You have to have climbed these other rated mountains and peaks and things, where you start to see that people could want to do something, but really not understand what it would actually take to do it. So the whole point there is that building an effective business is all about behavior change. And digging into that, BJ Fogg is a behavioral scientist, and you may be familiar with this equation. But to design for a specific behavior, you need a motivation and an ability and a trigger. And really, these need to exist at the same time for that behavior to happen. And so, from a behavior standpoint, that's really, if we abstract that a little bit, it's what someone does. As we think about motivation, that's why they want to do it. If we think about ability, that's how they'll achieve it. And if we think about triggers, that's what kickstarts the whole process. That can be an internal trigger, a motivation, a goal that they have. It could tie into that motivation. It could be something a friend said to them, right? If you were wanted to work out, but you didn't really have accountability, and your friend said, "Hey, how's your workout regimen going?" That'd be like an external trigger to say, "Oh yeah, I need to get back to that," and that might in turn help build some motivation and help you design essentially on the path to this behavior. Where many founders end up starting is really with this ability and how they will achieve it. So they go directly to a solution idea, they go directly to a service or a product or an application, but they don't really understand the motivation for why somebody wants to solve it, and the behavior for what someone does. So our recommendation for founders that are starting new startups is to start with motivation and behavior. But with motivation, do your users know it's a problem? How big is the problem? Why do they want to solve it? What happens if they do solve it? And what happens if they do nothing? And then pair that with, how have people tried to solve it today? What competitors are there? What substitutes? What have people paid to solve it? Time, effort, reputation. Those are all important. And as part of BJ Fogg's model here, there's also really mapping like how much motivation somebody has to solve it, and how easy it is. This is where your solution could come into play, whether that's a text-based solution or an iOS app or something. There's really this behavior line that he's found in his studies, to, if somebody has high motivation but it's really hard to do, it still might not happen, right? So that's where your solution design or your application or your startup ties into this. So bridging the gap between how motivated someone is and their ability to do it is really important. And that's where user experience comes into play. Somebody could be really motivated to do something, but the ability they have is really hard, or your app's really hard to use. So they end up giving up and trying a competitor. So there's many cases along this story, with this line that you could tell stories on, where people have been highly motivated to achieve something, but their ability kind of inhibited that action to take place. And just to build upon what I mentioned before, a lot of startups start here. Step one, draw the outline. Step two, draw the owl. If you're familiar with this, you know that there are infinite amount of steps in between in order for you to actually draw an owl to a very high fidelity. The same thing with startups, where you have an idea. A lot of founders jump directly to, oh, I need a developer to ultimately build this, and think that's going to result in a profitable product. But the behavior change really is a spectrum. And as we go, think about that behavior model, there's a lot of things that are going to prevent you from having a successful business if you don't understand the motivations of a user, how they think about it, what their perspective is, and how valuable it is for them to solve. And then for you to design an app that addresses that behavior change, you just don't see that happen often. So a good place to start as you're discovering, some problems we're solving, is understand, one, who your customer is, who are you solving this for, and then two, where are they right now and where are they trying to go? And if you take a look into the market, you can actually learn a lot about existing behavior, based on competitors that are in the space, solutions in the space. But as you find folks to talk to about this problem and whether they have it, and start doing some problem discovery and understand, what the perspective is, you'd understand how they're solving it today and why they're falling short. So a lot of times people will go from, if your market looks like this and you don't have any demonstrated demand in the market, or it's not it's not clearly defined, it's going to be hard for you to make a product or an offering or anything really that's going to meet those needs, unless you're thinking of you're kind of combining insights from multiple industries or multiple paths that would kind of converge into some sort of new innovation. But oftentimes when we create startups, we look like this. We see many competitors, but there's a reason why a lot of them fall short. And so when we think about a new product idea, we think of it in relation to the substitutes or competitors that people are hiring in the space. So in order for you to really gain traction with your startup, and gain confidence and ultimately bring development into that process, we think of it as kind of as a shortcut here, where you just build a product, from your idea. And so the gaps that you have to fill inside of that include understanding that motivation, the behavior, and your app is really, if we think about that equation again, your app really gives them the ability to get it. It's really the medium that delivers the value to your users. So, one of the important things is talking to customers, and one question, that you're going to have is, how might you find them? So finding people that you think have the idea that you can talk to, that you can get perspective, is going to be really helpful. So you can find them through your personal network. A lot of times this is, people this is your relationships, friends, family. Social media is a big part of this, but you can start searching competitors and substitutes that you're aware of, and just look for people complaining, and then you'll be able to see where things are falling short. Did they leave the platform? You could really start to weave together some evidence around and to support your idea. The next thing would be your population samples. You can find people to talk to about really in this problem phase about what struggles they've had in this journey, what sort of things have they tried to solve, and really ask questions about really the context of how they've approached the solving the problem, and then be able to uncover things you didn't know or you weren't able to find through other methods of primary research. A big thing here is using experts and proxies. So as an amplifier, let's say in if you're creating an app that's for married couples, as a proxy, instead of trying to reach 1,000 married couples, you could reach out to 10 counselors who counsel married couples, and you can use them as a proxy to really bubble up information and insights that would have taken you a long time to gather. We're really gathering it through more of a funneled source that has experience. The other thing would be expert blogs and people that are very in tune with the problem that you're solving. You could also source people through the profile search, being able to find folks from trade show lists if it's an enterprise product, through association sponsors, and then Google X-ray Boolean searches, which allows you to extract and exclude folks from those searches. The other side of really finding folks that you can talk to is trying to attract them. So using things, there are tools out there like Beta List, Beta Page, Product Hunt, things that you can put your value prop out into the world without a product, and start sourcing data from people. Start seeing who resonates most with the value prop or your messaging or the offering that you're proposing, and then be able to gather and gather newsletter signups. It could be potentially a paid offer, and start collecting data from them on what their preferences are. And a lot of times you can use this as a screener for more interviews, for more folks to talk to. So when you're creating a data or survey collection mechanism, that could be tools like Typeform, SurveyMonkey, Google Form, where somebody signs up to your newsletter, and then you ask them some questions around, hey, what's the biggest problem you're facing today? How have you tried to solve it? What tools that you're aware of in this space have you tried using, and why aren't they working for you? And start to get some context and really gather enough just keep gathering more and more data that can help you understand where your product or startup might fit in the marketplace. And then you can follow up with those folks. Say, hey, I'd love to, grab 15 minutes of your time, or, half an hour of your time, and learn more about the problems you're having, and, how you're solving them. And these will give you a lot of context. There are secondary research papers out there and studies that folks have done. but would recommend, rather than relying on statistics of kind of widespread surveys, rely more on qualitative and context dependent things, so you can really understand the struggles that someone has and why they can't solve them today versus just a number in a specific survey. Before we keep going, any questions from any folks in what we've covered so far? No? All right, we'll keep going. So one thing that's important in how you can use use prototypes to start building upon your idea and really gaining perspective on that behavior change is using prototypes. So these are things that you can create that don't need development. In some cases, it could use development. Depends how real your product is, and we'll talk about that in a few moments here. But as you create a prototype, there's a few things to clarify here. All prototypes are MVPs. An MVP is a minimum viable product, but not all MVPs are prototypes. And I think there can be confusion between the two. An MVP could be a working version of your software. It could be, could be many different things. But to clarify, an MVP is a prototype with minimum functionality that facilitates learning. So this could be, as we mentioned before, this could be an interview script. This could be a sketch. It doesn't have to be a real product. And a prototype, which we'll talk about here, is a tool that can help you communicate your idea, what value you can provide, and really help you learn. The big thing about prototypes and using them as you think about your startup or effort is that they can help you tell a story and use something tangible with visuals to explain your intent. And this is something that we talk about with our team a lot, but there's always 4 conversations that happen. If you're just talking in to person like this, there's always what you said, what you thought you said, what the other person heard, and what they thought they heard. And so using these prototypes will help you to really reduce the fog and the confusion around what you actually mean, and start getting examples of things where you're getting out of this mental model and you're providing a physical model for them to wrap their mind around. So as you describe your idea, it could mean a lot of different things to a lot of people. So as you get closer to a product launch, or you get closer to launching something to the market, using models, using prototypes, using these will help you get better feedback. In a lot of cases, will give you feedback around what did your customers assume that assume that your product did that it doesn't. It will give you feedback around really a lot of perception. So with startups, and this is big in lean startup as well, but you can learn the best with prototypes by getting out of the building and putting real enough things in front of users. And so for here, obviously we're in a COVID world. We're not post-COVID yet. You can't just go walk into any building and start interviewing users with your prototype. So you're doing it over things like Zoom. You're doing it over these digital means and getting them in front of folks. The other thing when you think about prototypes is real enough depends on who your users are and what types of experiences they're familiar with and accustomed to. For example, it will be hard to actually sell a product into an enterprise if you are showing them a sketch. So back to the problem we talked about, if you're trying to learn whether or not someone thinks it's a problem, you can use a sketch to do that. If you give an executive a sketch to bring to their board to evaluate your software and whether or not they should use you, that's not going to be a great path forward for you to get adoption inside of that company. So understanding the context and who your audience is and what you're trying to learn will help you understand what real enough is. And so we'll talk about that a little bit now. And how real should my MVP or should my prototype be? And there's this vector here between time and realness, and a couple lines, a couple thresholds here. One is real enough to test, and something that you can get in front of somebody, you can learn from, you can really start to hone your idea and figure out what needs to change about it for it to represent what's going on in the world, and also launch. And this is what John Zeratsky and Jake Knapp refer to as the Goldilocks zone. They talk a lot about this in design sprint, as you're prototyping products, figuring out like what is the right mix. You can see here there's a big gap, and that's going to depend on that realness factor that you need. So a sketch in a wireframe, if you can see here, is this purple line where, hey, it's real enough to test, it's real enough to get in front of users, I can get feedback, it communicates my idea. It's not real enough to launch. It's not even close to real enough to launch, and it's probably not real enough to close anybody on your product. But you could start to get behavior like, "Hey, I'm interested in that value prop. Sign me up for when it comes out. I'd love to learn more." It's going to be very hard to close on a Kickstarter is a good example of this. If you went to Kickstarter and you saw a product that was out there that's not real yet, and they just had a sketch of it rather than a high polished video, what are the chances you're going to pledge and buy something from somebody? Probably a lot lower. But if you saw a video of it in action and it was the only one they made, but it was a prototype and it looked like it delivered all the things you needed, you'd be a lot more likely to actually buy it. And so that realness factor is something that you have to wrestle with as a founder. In some cases here, and these are exaggerated just for scale, but building a real product can take a long time. And if you wait until it's real enough to test, you don't have too much longer before it's real enough to launch. And one of those things is not just the time to actually launch it, but the time to iterate on it across the strategy of your product, across design, across development, getting user feedback. That whole feedback loop is a lot longer. And products that have launched in the market deal with this all the time, where they have new features, new things they want to do, yet they're beholden to all the things they've already built. And so you kind of have competing priorities between reinventing how you serve customers and also how you're serving customers today. So both of those things. In building a prototype, it can be very real, and over time, it's definitely not a one-shot deal. You could definitely continue honing prototypes and continue working on them. And you'll never really launch a prototype. And to be clear, I'll clarify this later, but a clickable prototype, one that you can click, that the user can't enter data into, none of the data persists on the back end. It's really just used as a tool to get feedback, to get them testing, to understand, maybe even usability testing, placement messaging, those sort of things. If you're using no-code tools, this is definitely something that you could shortcut into, becoming a real product. And depending on industries that you're serving, like healthcare, financial tech, logistics, supply chain, anything with sensitive data, it'll be hard for you to actually deploy a no-code tool and have somebody adopt it, just due to all of the red tape and compliance concerns that you have. The other thing is, for a lot of SaaS companies that are serving those markets, there's a lot of integrations that are dependent on your product being successful that certain no-code tools won't be able to tackle. But you could see it's real enough to test fairly quickly, and you could ultimately launch it, in a reasonable amount of time. And so mapping all of these together, you see, again, a sketch or a wireframe, a clickable prototype, a no-code solution, and functioning product. So before I go forward, any questions that would be good to tackle now? Looks like there's one in the chat. What if I'm a founder with good design skills? I can potentially use a no-code solution to build something, but how do I make it look decent? Or is that not important for a prototype or MVP? How do I strike that balance between good looks and functionality? I think that it depends on a few factors. Who's your customer and what are they accustomed to, and what other tools are you competing with? Are you building your prototype to learn? Are you building your prototype to raise funding from investors? Are you trying to pitch the vision of it, or are you really trying to get feedback? And I think defining the question you want to answer and the goal that you have will help guide that. If it's to, and maybe you could clarify your goal, and I could give you some more context. That'd be good. But yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on who you're serving, what goal you're actually trying to get to, and whether or not something more low fidelity will get you there. So let's dive into each one of these types of prototypes that you can use to start getting these models in front of users. So the first one is a sketch or a wireframe. So the benefits, anyone can draw. You can leverage this prototyping on paper. I'll break down each one of these tools as we go, but it's a tool there you can take a photo, or you can essentially sketch on a piece of notebook paper, take a photo of it, and stitch it together like it was a real prototype. And you can click it and have users go through the flow, and you can get feedback that way. You could also upload photos of web-based app sketches, to a tool like Figma and start stitching those together. And then, the other one that you could use is Whimsical has a lot of built-in wireframing tools to really give you, and we had a session on this late last week on wireframing your product in Whimsical, and we can definitely link to that, Jacob, if you get a chance, but that will give you tips on how to start thinking about your idea, that you can start getting, these tools in front of users. So Marvel acquired the company POP, and POP stands for prototyping on paper. So you can take photos and actually, start to link screens together as you would experience it in a normal app. Figma, this is a high fidelity example, but you can build low fidelity examples in Figma, and we'll talk about that as well with some other examples here. And then this is what wireframing in Whimsical looks like. So it looks pretty real. It's not something you could launch. It's not something that you could actually send to the market. There would be a lot of connecting that would need to happen in this product. But you can see here they handle navigation well. They also are mobile and navigation well. They also handle web applications, and these are two templates that come for you out of the box. And I believe with Whimsical you get for free. So these are all these solutions I covered so far are free for you to use. So there's not big licenses preventing you from using these tools. The other option here is building a real bespoke product, and I added bespoke because this is a custom product that has a lot more complexity, and the world is your oyster, which is the blessing and the curse of you as a startup founder is you could do anything, but really deciding what you do, since there's not too many constraints. So things that involve that are hiring a developer, finding a technical co-founder, kind of guess what to build. If you hop right to building and aren't focused on really user motivation and behavior, you kind of spend weeks and months to building, where this could be prohibitive for you. So the next one we'll talk about is building a high fidelity prototype. So you can use these free tools, Figma, Webflow, Bubble. This could also be a website and landing page, and we'll talk a little bit about how you might measure those in the future. This could be an app that you design, a prototype app. And there's ways that you can be resourceful and find UI kits and adapt. And each one of these resources that we'll talk about, they kind of go a little bit into high fidelity prototyping, but then also a little bit of the no code realm, where there's some barrier, some learning curve, but you can achieve something that's real enough to test and potentially deliver value for your users in these as well. So Figma has a community where you can go and search applications and things that you can stitch together. So essentially drag and drop inside of Figma, and we have a ton of tutorials at Headway here for Figma prototyping and Figma wireframing that will be helpful if you decide to go down this route. Plugging our own UI kit that we created, so you're able to use components and different things inside of Figma that you can drag and drop. Here's an example of using all of the components that we've built to be able to create a email application. The other tool I talked about is Webflow. So this is a tool actually Headway's website's built on, and they have a WYSIWYG kind of drag and drop editor, click and edit previews that you can use to then start creating your landing pages and start to get your value proposition out there. So have seen a lot of companies moving away from WordPress to something like this, or something more custom like a Gatsby or Gatsby React contentful type stack for their sites. But if you're a non-technical co-founder or a non-technical founder, Webflow is definitely friendly. They have a good community of of folks, and they have a lot of templates that you could really start off to test your value proposition and whether or not people will sign up for what you're offering. The next thing here is Bubble, which we talked about briefly, but Bubble has a lot of templates that you could start off, and this is their showcase. Bubble, just as a fun fact, they've had startups who have raised, $345 million on it in venture capital, and the startup still runs on a no-code solution. So depending on volume, throughput, concurrency, how advanced your app is, no code could be a solution for you. Also depends, as I mentioned before, on the context of your users and how secure and compliant things need to be. So the next one gets to using no-code tools, which I mentioned 2 of them already, but these really help you go into much more real. You can start delivering user value using no-code tools where you can test perception. You can test if your application relies as a marketplace style or relies on user-generated content or profiles. You can test whether or not people will give you that information right away. And if they don't, you can start to iterate on that relatively quickly and learn more about kind of this process and this spectrum of how a user engages with you. You can test onboarding. You can start to measure behavior inside of your app and really build engagement funnels using all of these tools. So we talked about the first 2. We'll just talk about the last 2 here. Bravo Studio is an application that you essentially can upload your completed Figma design into, and you can select Airtable, any REST API. So if you have development resources that are creating APIs for data storage, you're creating Google Sheets, things like that, you can tap that into here and really have your app be dynamic and request your app packages. So they then convert that to deployable packages for Apple and Android, and you can really launch into the market with just focusing on design, a little bit of data component, and start testing your idea. The next part here is Glide. They're really focused on making it drop dead simple to essentially create your data model in a Google Sheet, and in 5 minutes, turn that into an app. So if you haven't heard of Glide, very, very interesting. Have seen a lot of companies do internal apps this way. They can do some payments, and their pricing model is built on kind of a payment share model if you're free. But again, all of these have free versions, and some of them, they're free for a staging site, so you wouldn't have your own domain, but things that you can still use to learn and test while you're in alpha and kind of early stages. So we'll stop there and see any questions. So one of them here is, when's the right time to pivot from a no-code solution to custom software? Do I need to raise a round to go from something like Bubble to a team building my product? The answer, unfortunately, is it depends. I think it depends on the limitations of that, of Bubble and the tool that you're using. I think that it could be a tool that your application could be on for a long time, but I think when you get to integrations, you get to single sign-on support, you get to other things, there might be some limitations you'll run into where it would make sense to build out your own platform and then be able to control that end to end. I think one of the risks of no-code tools is that they're so new, so we don't really know how long they're going to be around. So there is inherent risk in having all of your tool in one product. And I know Bubble, for example, you can't ever migrate off of Bubble directly. Like you can't just export your code and say, oh, I'm going to launch it on my own. So there is risk there that you're relying on a specific platform to kind of run your product. So I would say as you grow and as you have more means, I would say it makes sense in most cases to move off of something like that. But it depends on what tools you're using and what the trajectory of that team is. The next question here is there any way for me to get an app on the App Store with no-code solutions? Yeah, I mean, just as we talked about, Bravo app was the app that I mentioned that you can get on the App Store with a no-code solution. So you would have to have the design in a high fidelity way. You'd also have a data model or an API to connect that to, and that's the tool. Apologies for gliding through this. That's this tool, bravostudio.app, where you'd be able to essentially get your app right into the App Store. And again, I don't know a lot of the supporting technology out there as you think about a scalable no-code solution. I don't know what assumptions this makes for you and how changeable anything is. Because I think one of the risks to no code of something like this is you're requesting app packages and you're publishing them to the store yourself, or maybe you have a developer who does that. I think um, one of the issues is that most of the time, a lot of the time that you spend building your app is just the start, and you want to be able to really iterate really quickly. So I don't know what that iteration time or those cycles look like with a tool like Bravo. If you if you continue having to upload and import a new Figma app and connect it, or if it updates and persists and you can introduce changes. So I think thinking about that, is a risk where you're going to want to be able to be sure you can adjust to user feedback as you're getting feedback, from them when you launch. All right, how do you measure user engagement with no-code tools? So we have, actually, that's a good segue into this next section, which is thinking like a pirate, and really how do you measure validation with no-code tools and user actions, and really tying it back to that behavior that we talked about. So the pirate model was introduced by Dave McClure, who is the founder of 500 Startups. If you're familiar with them, they're a big accelerator that have spun out a lot of successful companies, and kind of later, more recently, founded Practical Venture Capital. But the pirate model really stands for these 3 A's and 3 R's, and I've seen it portrayed a few different ways. So the first one would be awareness, and this is talking about, is your brand recognizable with your target audience? Does your reputation precede you? If you ask somebody about your app or your business, like, would they know who that was? Acquisition, can you obtain new customers that sign up through your early adopter forms, your beta lists, your newsletters? Activation, once you've obtained them, do they actually create an account? Do they add their content? Do they reach their aha moment in your app? And so when you think about activation metrics, this changes depending on what your app does. And this should really try to get them not just activated as an account user, but also activated from a what's the first action you wanted them to take, or something that would start to ingrain some more value for them in your platform. And you can do that with no-code tools, definitely. The other one is retention. So are customers coming back? If so, how frequently? What features are most used? What features are never or rarely touched? Referrals. Are your customers creating customers for you? What's your viral coefficient? A good coefficient is basically, it's basically a metric that says how many people does the average person tell about you. So if you can have some referral metrics, or things inside of your app that really entice that's going to help your application grow. So anything good is over 1. So the average person tells 1 friend about you, that would be good, and that would start to have exponential growth for your startup. And that's a big reason why COVID is so so booming. I think in some cases it's like 1.3 or 1.2. You can just see the effects of compounding that has across the world. Each person who has COVID tells 1.3 people, and don't quote me on that quote, but I think that's one of the numbers I saw. And you could just see, it doesn't sound like a lot, but at the same time, you can see how that starts to permutate throughout the population. And then the last one is revenue. So are people paying for your solution? How much? What's a customer's lifetime value? So a lot of times when you're using no-code tools or prototypes, we'll try to move this revenue up the ladder. So rather than it being a lagging indicator, we can start to price test early on. And so we'll get a lot of times when we're testing and you're using prototypes, you can test acquisition. A lot of times that looks through, like click-through rates on ads if you're doing any paid promotion, landing page conversion rates. So if you're using tools like a Webflow, you could use Squarespace to do this. You could use really any tool that gives you a template, since it's about your messaging and the value proposition. And then, can you acquire names and emails and phone numbers? Another one is really that we see, currency that we see people voting is conversations. So of those users that you reach out to talk about the problem, how many of them actually say yes? And how many of them, one thing that you can test without a product is how many of those conversations will say, hey, Thanks so much for talking about, this is super insightful for us. Who else do you know that we should talk to, or who do you know that has this problem? And that's a good indicator of kind of what their perception is of you or your startup or your idea. Um, from an activation standpoint, surveys are super valuable. So again, this is using tools like um, like Typeform, Google Form, those things. Will people actually give you data? And this is really important if your application depends on people giving you data for it to be successful. Profile completion is kind of the same thing. So the other referrals, survey. So when somebody fills out this survey, will they add an email you should reach out to? Hey, who should we know that we don't? Or who do you think would be interested in this? And then you can reach out to them directly and say, hey, so and so, told me that you're having this same problem. Like, would love to talk to you about how you're solving it. And then from a revenue standpoint, these pre-launch offers, will people pay now or give you payment info? So Stripe has a way for you to withhold payment until a certain date. Apple Pay just came out with some new ways for you to accept pre-launch offers on the App Store, where you can introduce an app, and then as long as the payment period is within a certain amount of time, you could test that with them. So there's a lot of ways where you can start to test demand and really test how valuable a problem is and how much motivation someone has without actually building the product. And a lot of times, as we think back to that example of, draw the outline, draw the owl, you have to fill in the gaps. And a lot of times that is in the form of this behavior. Like, is there measurable behavior? And this is really getting at, in those interviews you talk to, people said they were motivated to solve it, but when you give them the opportunity through your landing page or through, if it's a no-code tool or through a prototype, like, will they actually do it? And that's kind of how you should think about validation. And all of that can come before or after or during you have developers. So just kind of circling back and talking about the topic, like, you don't need developers to launch your startup. You can use tools to learn out there. You shouldn't let not having the funds or a technical co-founder prevent you from testing your idea. You shouldn't let hey, I don't have funds to hire an agency or a company to do this. Like, is my idea dead in the water? If you gain traction and if you go in armed with these stats into an investor conversation, and you have a solid vision and you have demonstrated demand in the market, you can start to, you can get funding on that. There's been people who've got funding on just ideas, but if you can prove out behavior change and prove out revenue and in some of these numbers in investor conversations, you'll be able to get the funding you need to kind of take it to the next step, whether that's hiring a product team, product developers, or hiring an agency, or whatever's right for your situation. You'll be able to then invest in the right next step for you. And I don't know about you, but being an entrepreneur, I have a lot of ideas. So I would rather spend a lot of time figuring out if anything's here than spending all my time and money building something that I'm not sure anybody wants. And so all of kind of these tools and methods are really guided towards that. Can you gain confidence and really data around whether people are not motivated to change? So hopefully that was helpful and insightful for everybody, and kind of open it up now to questions. So we have, how do you measure user engagement with no-code tools? So I talked a little bit about the type of metrics that we would measure. You can measure with tools like Segment if you had that integrated, and that can then send to lots of tools like Intercom, which is one we definitely refer to and use a lot with our clients. You can use, really any tool that integrates Mixpanel, Aptium, lots of different accounts that will track events with those no-code tools. There is some configuration though that you have to do. Can I reuse any of the work I do in no-code if and when I need to build out a more custom solution? Is that different for web versus mobile? I think the big thing that that if you were to build no-code tools on your own, or or with somebody, that you have is you have the logic baked in, and you have kind of the path that users have gone through. So you have a lot to learn from. You're not building from scratch. You're learning more about behavior. If you're tracking with Google Analytics and Intercom and these other tools, you'll be able to understand what's working and really have a good starting point blueprint for you to build off of. And if you're a high if you're a designer who's doing a high fidelity no code tool where it looks real, no one can tell it's no code, then you really, you have that design to lean on, and you have that design to build and kind of bring in, with development. I would say it's not different for web versus mobile. I think, there are some considerations you might need to make, and John from our team could probably follow up with this question. I don't know if you can just point different packages on mobile to the App Store and be able to replace it wholesale. I'm assuming you would, but it might have to undergo a further review. So there's a little bit of risk there in the App Store review, if anyone's heard any nightmares from that. Do no-code tools scale? Any examples? So yeah, I think the ones that I look to for examples would be on Bubble itself. In some of their showcase tools, they have, I don't know from a user standpoint how many users a lot of these sites have. I think one of the good stories, and something we didn't really talk about other than a little bit with Google Sheets and stuff, is you can use forms to fake your entire product and really do what's called a concierge MVP, or like a Wizard of Oz MVP, where it looks like things are happening on the app or updating, but really it's someone doing it. And there's actually a story of somebody locally here that they built their startup, and I don't want to give away who it is, but they were able to get to millions of dollars of revenue per year in that concierge method, where users would fill out a form online, it would come to their back office, and they scaled with people before they scaled with software, and then they would fulfill those requests and get back to the user within days. And all of it seemed to happen in close to real time, or by a software, or by a solution, but yet it was really these no code tools integrated, and they've scaled to, I think it was just shy of $10 million a year in revenue. So I mean, that's a pretty decent scale. I mean, if you're talking about scale like Airbnb or Facebook, I would say I don't know anyone. If you know anyone, definitely share that with us. But I think you can begin to scale depending on what your application does, and who the no code kind of tools are that you're integrating, and whether or not there's any bottlenecks in volume or throughput, or scaling on their servers. Those would be more of the concerns. And then, any advice for a founder building something solo without the support of a team? Should I run sprints by myself, or just build what I think will work? I would definitely say, like, figure out a process for learning that you're going to follow, because it's easy to get entrapped by all the different ideas and feedback you're going to get from customers. So I think definitely create a roadmap that can kind of check you in what you said you were going to build, and really understand why you wanted to build that, what change you thought it would do in the market and for your users. And then when you get new requests, analyze those against where you thought the plan would be. Because I think it's easy, especially for a small team, that there's a lot of fires and all the burners are running at once. So being able to really look back at a plan and say, hey, we said we would do this. Here's how we prioritize it. Here's what we learned from our users and why we think this is important. And do a little bit of a comparison between, like, how much effort is this, or time of yours is it, and what are you not going to be able to do because of that if you add more to your roadmap and you're doing it. It would definitely distract you. Another question here. Is there a good target MRR to hit with no code before you invest in a custom solution? Should my idea be able to bootstrap itself, or should I raise funding? So a few different questions there. I think MRR is definitely dependent. I mean, if you have a enterprise solution that isn't super compliant, or doesn't need to be super compliant, and you're able to build it with a no code tool, you could hit 6 figures MRR without really a hitch. So I would say there's really no threshold. I think as a business, you have to balance, am I serving my customers the right way? Are there affordances or things we're giving up by using this no code tool that are really reasons that my customers would leave? Because you're trying to solve them really well, but you're always going to face market forces and other ideas that are out there, and innovations and things that are going to try and steal attention from you. every new thing that someone adopts is because you stole time from something else, those competitors or those substitutes. So I think it would really depend on, on your churn and whether people were leaving, the types of feedback you were getting, and how real the pain was from that no code tool. Should my idea be able to bootstrap itself? I think in an ideal world, a lot of investors you ask would say yes. A lot of other investors you ask will say no. I think it depends on the type of business that you're launching. I mean, there's lots of businesses out there, and Levels, or Peter, from Levels is a good example of that, where he's hit, multiple six-figure revenue just bootstrapping itself, and he's the designer, he's the developer, he's built it on, PHP, and he, from what I understand, still doesn't have a team. He might have a small team now that he works with, but manages a lot of things. So you can be a one-man band and you can bootstrap it on your own, but it's going to be, a lot of work for you to uncover what customers want, be able to design out what you think will do it, get those in front of users or enough users before you build it, and then be able to keep those features going at the same time. So in some cases you can bootstrap yourself. In other cases, one thing that would suggest is if you can pre-sell, that would help you start to bootstrap it yourself. If you can prove out and use prototypes to get revenue before you build it, that could fund your build. Another play inside of enterprise software is if you find key customer pilots that have the problem big enough that they're willing to fund the build of the initial version for them to have input and for them to kind of have a continuity license into the future. So a lot of cases, unfortunately, it depends, but I hope that context was helpful. All right, well, thanks so much for everybody. Jacob, I don't know if you want to close this out.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, so thanks everyone for hanging out, asking questions, and learning with us tonight. As a reminder, this is being recorded, so we'll have it available to you soon in your email, probably later this week, and then also available on our YouTube channel to rewatch. And again, if you have any questions after today, feel free to email Andrew at headway.io, and be sure to check out other Startup Week events at startupwi.org. There's still more events going on tomorrow for the last day of the week. So that's all I have. So take care, everybody, and have a great night.